the IEG event within the annual International Education Week at Boston College. I'm Tessa Delacool. I'm a research associate and doctoral student with the center, and I'm so pleased to welcome you all and to have you join us for this event. This year's IEW theme is exposing the fault lines, embracing social justice in the wake of a crisis, so certainly apt for this eventful year. Our event today is titled Education and Displacement, Inclusion, Exclusion, and Strategies for Social Justice, and will feature presentations by 3 scholars whose expertise is focused on pressing educational equity issues that we'll explore today, including how COVID-19 is impacting refugee education in Turkey with Dr. Hakan Ergin, how US State Center refugees, asylees, and temporary protected status holders in higher education policy with recent CIHE grad Dr. Lisa Unangs, and how the US elections taking place in a pandemic year are impacting DACA students with Dr. Raquel Muñiz. The format for today's event is as follows. Each speaker will present for approximately 10 minutes, followed by audience Q&A in the second half of our event. But please post your questions as we go in the chat box. And during and after the talks, and our CIHE Research Associate and recent grad, Dr. Ayanachu Olde-Georgis, will be collecting and organizing our questions for us. Thank you, Ayu. Just a heads up that today's talk will be recorded. And now onwards to formally introduce our speakers for today. Hakan Ergin holds a PhD in higher education from Boğaziçi University in Turkey. He earned his master's degree in adult education and bachelor's degree in foreign languages teaching from Boğaziçi University. During his master's, he studied as an international student at the State University of New York at Binghamton in the United States. During his doctoral studies, he was an international student at Würzburg University in Germany, and his research interests include internationalization of higher education, adult education, migration, right to education, and distance learning. He's previously served as a postdoctoral fellow at the CIHE at Boston College, and we're so happy to have him back for this event. He currently teaches at Istanbul University. Lisa Unangs is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Higher Education Governance, Ghent. Lisa's research interests include higher education access and experience among displaced learners, as well as comparative and cross-national constructions of diversity in higher education. She's an associate editor of Higher Education Research and Development, and editorial board member of the Journal of International Students and Higher Education Governance and Policy. Lisa has published in Comparative Education Review, the Journal of Higher Education Policy and Management, and Higher Education Policy, among other outlets. She is lead editor of the recent Burl Sense publication, Refugees and Higher Education, Transnational Perspectives on Access, Equity, and Internationalization. Raquel Muñiz, JD PhD, is in her 3rd year as Assistant Professor of Law and Education Policy at the Boston College Lynch School of Education and Human Development, and as a liaison with Boston College Law. She is an attorney and a social science researcher who studies how education law and policy can create more equitable education opportunities for all students, particularly students who have experienced substantial adversity. Her research focuses on the examination of the implications of law and policy on the education system and public policy decision-making, and on the use of social science research evidence in the legal system and public policy decision-making process. This research interest has led Muñiz to study laws and policies that contribute to the educational experience of different children, youth, and young adult populations. That being said, I'd like to now invite Hakan Ergin to share his presentation.
Okay, just let me share my screen. Can you see my screen right now? I think you can, right? Okay. Hello, colleagues. Greetings from Istanbul. Thank you so much for this excellent organization. I am really happy to be here with you. In my presentation, I will quickly talk about how the ongoing pandemic influenced Syrian refugee students' life in Turkey. As we all know, the war in Syria is 10 years old right now. And of course, as almost all the forced displacement cases did in the past history, this war in Syria has had huge impact on the neighboring countries. the United Nations describes the migration caused by the war in Syria as the biggest migration wave in the recent history. So the war in Syria caused over 6 million Syrians to move to another country. When we have a look at the number of Syrian refugees across the world, we see that over 65%, which is equal to 3.6 million Syrians have moved to Turkey. This figure makes Turkey host to the largest refugee population in the world. So, of course, Turkey has employed a couple of reforms to integrate Syrian teenagers, Syrian adults to integrate into Turkish higher education. And the government provided them with some scholarships and some other entrance regulations, etc. And when we have a look at the numbers, we see that actually there is a significant increase in the number of Syrian refugee students in Turkey. When the war started in 2011, the number was standing at 600, and right now it has already reached over 37,000. So in one of the papers that I wrote with Hans David and Betty Lesk, my dear colleagues, we introduced the concept forced internationalization for the integration of refugee students into host higher education systems. Of course, it is a little bit longer topic of discussion, another topic of discussion, but we underline something in this concept. Refugee students are not traditional international students. They have lots of disadvantages. They, in most cases, they lack proficiency in the local country's language. They lack funding for their study at a university, and they lack some of the important documents like previous academic transcripts and maybe even a passport. That is why we came up with an idea in this concept that refugees are the most vulnerable group in international higher education. In a couple of qualitative research studies, which I have been doing right now during the pandemic, I have come up with a conclusion that the pandemic doubles the refugee vulnerability in Turkey. I'm just gonna give a couple of examples from my research. Different from most university students, actually refugees have to work. Let me give you an example from Turkey. Just 1 in every 5 refugees is provided a government scholarship, which means that a vast majority of them have to work. When I ask them their jobs, they work as a waiter, as a worker at a factory, and even as a construction worker. And with the pandemic, unfortunately, everywhere is closed and they cannot find a job easily, and most of them are unemployed right now. And when I compare to their attendance to their classes in face-to-face and online classes, I see that there is a lower attendance to online classes. This is because in most cases, they don't have enough technological equipments like a laptop or maybe the internet connection. And even if they have to share them with their brothers or sisters, because an average refugee family is including 7 or 8 people in Turkey right now at home. And as we know, forced displacement unfortunately causes some traumatic experiences. So most refugee students used to take some psychological support from universities before the pandemic. Right now, most of them cannot receive these counseling services, although some universities offer these counseling services through some online platforms. Most of them cannot access these counseling services, unfortunately. Of course, there is a more vulnerable group in a vulnerable refugee group, and these are student refugee moms. In one of the qualitative research studies, I interviewed 15 student refugee moms who have children and who continue their higher education at a university in Turkey. And right now, unfortunately, none of them can attend the classes because they have to take care of the children at home. Before the pandemic, they used to send their kids to school, And while they were at school, they used to come to university. But right now, as schools are also closed, they have to take care of their kids at home. And also they have to be busy with some housework. So that is why they cannot access online courses, unfortunately. So that is why I believe that they are the most vulnerable, unfortunately. And of course, there is a media effect in local and international news programs. The idea is, the argument is that it is a misconception. The number of COVID cases is higher in refugee population. But I checked the numbers. I see that in not just Turkey, but most countries, the number of COVID cases in the local society is quite higher than the one in refugee societies. And even in refugee camps, the numbers are not higher than the one in local societies. So this creates a misconception that refugee students might be a transmitter of the pandemic, unfortunately. So we have to fight with this misconception as well, because in the interviews, I see that they are disturbed with this misconception. So I can come up with a couple of inferences. The pandemic hits refugee students, unfortunately, here in Turkey, because they were vulnerable, and right now they have become also more vulnerable financially, sociologically, psychologically, and academically. Of course, in order to minimize these disadvantages, they need to be provided with some financial, logistical, like laptop, internet connection, and also psychological support. But of course, I always, in every presentation, I remind that the refugee crisis is not a local problem. It is a global problem. We saw it a couple of years ago in the crisis happened in Greece and other European countries. So international awareness should be raised about it. As a developing country, Turkey cannot actually carry this burden on its own shoulder. And 85% of refugees live in developing countries. So I think some international aid is needed to help more refugees, actually. And due to the news, actually, which says that refugees might be dangerous pandemic transmitters, and refugee societies are more dangerous in terms of the pandemic. Maybe in the post-pandemic times, there might be another discrimination, a health-related discrimination towards refugee students on campuses. So in the post-pandemic era, we should inform the stakeholders of higher education, including the academics, students, and other staff members, that anyone, not just refugees or settled people, local people, can get the virus, actually. So I just want to finish the presentation with this sentence: the pandemic does not create discrimination, but people do. Thank you so much for your attention.
Hakan, thank you for your insightful presentation. The Turkish case you present certainly makes clear the specific vulnerabilities experienced by refugee students during the pandemic. We'll be taking questions to Hakan after the other presenters, so please do post your questions in the chat box in the meanwhile. I'd like to now welcome our next speaker, Lisa Unangst. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Sorry about that. Just need 1 second. Hakan, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to having the opportunity to hear more about your thoughts on your current work at the end of this session. So why is this doing this? Sorry. So I'm going to be speaking today, as Tessa said at the beginning, about a paper that's under review right now that I wrote with colleagues Isara Casillas-Connors and Nicole Barone. This paper is focused on state-based policy supports for refugee, asylee, and temporary protected status background students in the US context. I'll refer to these students together, this amalgamation of students, as displaced students for the rest of my talk today, but want to acknowledge that displaced students does mean different things at different times, and researchers working in this area are called to be specific about what they mean here. So a bit of background. How many refugees are there in the US? And I'm putting refugees in quotation, again, to sort of reference this uncertainty around what does a refugee mean versus someone who has a displaced background. Well, we know, for example, that the number of refugee admissions in the US case has fallen over the last several decades, which is what we see in the graph at the left here. About 3 million refugees have been resettled in the US since the 70s. And I break out here a few of the different groups that I'm talking about today, again, under this heading of displaced people, displaced students. And I think what we can say with some certainty, though data in this area is sometimes scarce, that we're likely looking at millions of refugee background or displaced students in the US context. This might mean that the student themselves relocated to the US as a refugee, asylum seeker, or is holding TPS status. It might also mean that their family relocated and they received this status through that family journey. And how does the US compare in terms of numbers with the rest of the world? So just a snapshot of the last decade or so, we can see that the US had been taking in higher numbers, although again, thinking of that last slide, we know that this has declined over time, and there has been a precipitous drop in the last handful of years. So when we think about refugee or displaced students in higher education in the United States, what do we think about? You know, very broadly, are there programs in place at the federal or the state or the institutional level that explicitly support students of displaced background? Well, the argument has been made by scholars that the US case is similar to other more economically developed countries in that displaced students are not typically recognized as a distinct equity group, meaning that there isn't a separate federal stream of funding or state stream of funding, or frequently institutional stream of funding at the college or university level that supports students of refugee or asylee background. However, many students of displaced background may be served by other programs, such as TRIO programs, those that look to support students who may identify as having first-generation status, may identify as being racially minoritized. And this is something that my colleagues and I refer to as incidental engagement or incidental support, right? So again, not being specified as a distinct equity group. Because there is this sort of dearth of information about how these students are being served, also a scarcity of literature on the topic, we decided to move forward with critical policy analysis to look at the education policies of states in the US to see how they were explicitly supporting these groups or not, right? So were these students being incidentally served, explicitly served, and how could we see gaps among states? We decided for our sample to look at what we thought would be a policy-rich set of states, meaning that we took 16 states that are ranked in the top 10. And there's a little disconnect here because there's some overlap between these lists. So they're ranked in the top 10 of refugee resettlement by the Census Bureau and Pew Research, either in absolute numbers or on a per capita basis, right? So grouping these lists of 10 states together, there was overlap, and we identified the 16 states that resulted. And our team of 3 researchers looked at the state policies that were in place around in-state tuition, around access to higher education in general, and applied critical policy analysis. The states are listed at the bottom of the slide here. So I'm going very quickly here, but to jump into our findings, so indeed what we found was that even in these policy-rich state contexts, we found that states were not specifying policies or programs or structures that explicitly supported displaced students. Instead, what we found was that state-based policy documents were most likely to identify how these groups should be quantified, right? How they should be reported at the state level and to federal authorities for various types of funding. For example, there was consistent discussion of the non-resident alien category. I have a feeling that Raquel may be speaking more about this in a moment, but this category, as defined by the National Student Clearinghouse here, really represents sort of an amalgamation of different student backgrounds that in this case includes students of displaced background, but many other students as well. Further, state-based policies indicated that once a student was given this non-resident alien label, race, for example, was not collected, right? So essentially we're seeing non-resident alien identity as a constructed alternative to race. And this has some interesting implications for displaced students, not all of whom will self-identify as students of color, but many of whom will experience racism or racialization in the US context. So one way to think about this then is that we see through this quantification of displaced students, perhaps a liminal state, right? That students of displaced background in the United States may experience racialization and or discrimination, but be excluded from mainstream equity narratives, as suggested by other authors. And a few more specific findings. So, well, we did see across state contexts that most approved refugees had access to in-state tuition at public institutions after a waiting period of 12 months. So this is something to keep in mind. The cross-national literature tells us that waiting periods in general mean that students are less likely to pursue higher education, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. Further, that sometimes after this 12-month waiting period that students would need to apply for resident status, that they had to provide different types of documents. And again, the cross-national literature tells us that this sort of bureaucratic process can inhibit student access to higher education. In most cases, people who were in the process of having an asylum claim reviewed did not have access to in-state tuition. There were a handful of exceptions. In all cases, we found that there was no state-based centralized information for students of displaced background on the policies or structures that applied to them. So for example, if a student in New York of refugee background was approaching higher education and thought, I would like to know what my options are in this state. What do I qualify for in terms of funding, in terms of in-state tuition? Are there any specific scholarships available for me? There really isn't a central portal to access that information. So what the student would be doing is going in between university websites to try and find university-specific information. And again, we think that this represents an information barrier that has been seen in other national contexts. And then finally, what emerges from the policy documents through omission, or what we refer to as policy silence, is a lack of accurate data and representation on how many displaced students there are in any given state seeking to access higher education, as well as how many are actually enrolled. We argue that this inhibits the development of policy and practice that is supportive for this relatively large student group. But to end with a few bright spots, right? We do talk about in our paper, as we look towards a future research agenda, that indeed it seems that at least some colleges and universities and some college and university systems, for instance, the California Community College system, which has just allocated $5 million for a refugee student grant program. There are a number of mechanisms in place, right? So colleges and universities frequently offer intercultural skills training for students, staff, and faculty. How could this be thought of as a resource to support displaced students already on campus, as well as prospective students? This movement towards online and hybrid degree programs that's happened particularly since COVID, although certainly there are challenges associated with it, does seem as though it has some potential to make higher education more accessible. And what would this look like for students of displaced background? How do we think about college recruitment and application materials? Some institutions like the University of Buffalo offer fact guides about the university in 16 languages. These are targeted at communities, immigrant communities in the area, and offered in those languages, so that prospective students, as well as their families and support networks, have access in their preferred language to information about the institution. So a broad range of possible programmatic supports and interventions represented at the college and university level. So I'm going to stop there. That was so fast. Look forward to your thoughts and questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I didn't realize how limited the federal state policies were here in the United States, but perhaps not surprised, because as you said, it's similar to other national contexts. Looking forward to our discussion. Again, we'll be collecting all of your questions for Lisa, so please do post them in the chat box. Our next speaker is Raquel Muniz. It's all yours, Raquel.
Just to check, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the actual slide? Okay, perfect. So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so excited to be here today to talk to each of you, and also so nice to see familiar faces and recognize familiar names in the audience. So thank you for that. So today what I'm going to be doing is talking specifically about the DACA policy, right, and how that has an impact on higher education. But more than that, diving into some of the national government, the election year, where are we at, right, with DACA, and what does that mean for higher ed, in other words. So to begin with the policy itself, the key aspect of it is the use of prosecutorial discretion. It was announced back in 2012, and it is a result of prosecutorial discretion by the federal executive branch, meaning that the executive branch has the ability to allocate resources for immigration enforcement as they see fit. And the Obama administration, through the policy, set a change in enforcement priorities. He essentially classified DACA eligible recipients as a low priority for deportation. And I think that this is a key piece of the policy, because some of the lawsuits that followed after were really focused on changing the classification of this policy from a prosecutorial discretion action to akin to creating a law, right, which is only reserved for the legislature. And so that's a key distinction. So if anything, the policy was a social, social policy that acted as a large-scale experiment. In other words, what happens to an entire generation of undocumented youth when they receive benefits that allow them to be socially integrated into society through these policy benefits? Of course, partially, right? Because it didn't necessarily give them all the benefits that others may enjoy. But what they did enjoy was a 2-year reprieve from deportation after extensive background checks, authority, and the potential authority to work, they had to apply for this as well. And then the opportunity to apply for a Social Security number, which is tied back to the authority to work. Now, here, some of the benefits that fall from that, right, might include the ability to apply for financial aid that requires a Social Security number, right? And very much like what Lisa was explaining, these are more like collateral benefits, right? They're able to access them because now they have a Social Security number. They're not benefits that are necessarily designed for them. So given the age of most DACA eligible recipients, they were mainly in school, some of them in high school, some of them entering higher education, and some of them in the higher education context already. As we know, it was rescinded by the Trump administration in 2017, right, during an increase in overt anti-immigrant nationalist sentiments nationally. Right, the rescission and the zero tolerance policy during the Trump administration was a key aspect of the agenda for the Trump administration in the area of immigration law. Eventually, after the rescission, it was kept in place by a flurry of lawsuits across the country, including lawsuits in California, DC, Maryland, and they all followed the rescission, right? And the main arguments that the plaintiffs furthered in these cases were that the rescission was arbitrary and capricious, right? That the Trump administration had failed to really consider the impact of a rescission on those that benefited from the policy. They also argued that the Trump administration had intentionally discriminated against the recipients based on their nationality and ethnicity, given that most identify as Latinos. And if you all recall some of the statements that he made earlier on in his campaign, they seem quite hostile towards Latinos, right? However, those latter constitutional challenges didn't really carry the day. What really kept the policy alive was the first arguments that I outlined here, which is the administration was arbitrary and capricious. They just failed to really consider what was at stake. Okay, so it kept these flurry of lawsuits, keep the policy in place after the rescission, but it already starts to chip away at the benefits. Essentially, only current beneficiaries were allowed to continue to apply, no new applicants. And the ability to travel abroad through what we call advanced parole, was no longer an option. So you could still work, have 2 years, have your Social Security number, can't travel, no new applicants. But what was at stake for undocumented students prior to DACA, I think is important, because these are part of what was at stake in front of the Supreme Court as well, right? How are these DACA recipients going to be impacted? They would essentially go back to being fully, I wanna sort of clarify that the status is not necessarily an immigration status, right? It gives protections, but the undocumented status remains. So what was at stake before? These were some of the main challenges that undocumented students faced. A lot of them were coming from first generation families, right? And so they had some of the challenges that arise there, including being able to access applications for college funding. They may not be able to apply for they do not apply for federal aid, I should say. So they have limited opportunities there. And simply understanding the higher education system, that know-how wasn't always entirely there. There were also in mixed status families, which meant that they had to often worry about their own ability to stay in the country, but also they feared the deportation of their relatives, right? Alongside that. Mental health concerns, there's a lot of literature in this area. Oh, I can't see the little arrows back and forth, so I'm glad that worked. But the mental health concerns, right? Like a lot of them weren't necessarily aware that they were undocumented up until they came into like high school, and then they realized that they didn't have the same opportunities as their peers. And so what that led to was often lower self-esteem, guilt and shame attached to their status, that stress and anxiety, and feeling as though the concept of liminality, sort of living in the margins of society, and I'm not able to integrate, even though essentially they had lived here their entire lives. And then at the campus level, some of the challenges that arise there are regarding the affordability of getting a college degree. If you're not able to finance your education and can't access, federal resources, which is a great source for many students, then you're kind of in a bind, right? You have limited ability to afford your college education. And more than that, these different campuses are beholden to some of the changes at the state level policy-wise, right? And so the policy contexts vary across the nation. And so what we see is that you might be in a state that allows you to enroll but prohibits the aid, or fully bans you from enrollment like Georgia, right? And no money and no, like absolutely no kind of aid. And some others that allow you, give you limited aid. So this has been described in the literature as creating this pockets of inclusion and exclusion, right? Your luck and your ability to complete your college degree really depends on where you're at. And so DACA essentially helped with some of these challenges, right? Because now they would be considered to have some sort of lawful presence in the state where prior they weren't allowed to enroll. So it opened the ability for some of these students to go. All of this was really at stake for the students. So here's to highlight some of the work that I've been doing alongside one of my doctoral students, Natalie Bork, who is not here today. She was with me actually yesterday. And so what we were doing here is really mapping together, what does that state policy look like when it comes to, well, I should say in relation to the flagship institutions across the country, and what do these flagship institutions actually do to be inclusive of their DACA recipients? And as you can see from here, there's a lot of room to grow, right? We found that out of all the 50 flagship institutions, only 7 of those are systemically inclusive, meaning they allocate resources very intentionally, some of them actually creating centers for students that are undocumented or documented in order to support them. And so this was the case. These 7 institutions are located across the country, including in states that would be considered to be more restricted in their policy at the state level when it comes to support. So that's to say, it underscores that it is possible to be more inclusive, but it does require a lot of resource allocation. So beyond the benefits that the policy gave undocumented students, right? And again, what was at stake when it comes to DACA, there was a host of sociocultural benefits that the students had an opportunity to enjoy, including a simple peace of mind, right? Better earnings, increased earnings, the ability for social mobility, the ability to have a driver's license, build your credit, health insurance, so on and so forth. And so again, even though the social integration wasn't fully complete, there was that partial integration that had a great deal of impact on the lives of these different recipients. So that brings me to the SCOTUS ruling, right, and higher education. So where are we at now? All of that, what I talked about, is basically what was at stake for these different DACA recipients. And the cases that essentially had kept the policy in place eventually made their way to the Supreme Court. And here the Supreme Court also looked at the 2 big arguments that I mentioned earlier. One, that the Trump administration had acted arbitrarily and capriciously. And 2, that they had essentially discriminated, right? It's a constitutional legal issue that was before the court against Latinos and Latinas. But here, very similar, the court sort of just focused on that first argument, which was, did the Trump administration act arbitrarily and capriciously? And what does that mean? And they eventually ruled that the administration did act arbitrarily and capriciously because they failed to consider what they call the reliance interest, right? And so they don't necessarily make any comments. By and large, they don't really comment on whether it's a good policy or not. They're really, or whether they think that it furthers any other kind of interest in the United States, including how to be, welcoming and inclusive, right? That was not part of the conversation. The only thing that they really focused on is, what does it mean to be arbitrary and capricious? And did they really consider the reliance factors? And so finding that they didn't, they essentially say, we are going to theoretically undo the rescission, right? And they say that they're going to send back the policy so that the Trump administration can consider, quote unquote, the problem anew. That's how they described it, right? And so that did go down again. The policy remained in place. And a lot of advocates, I think, anticipated that essentially the undoing of the rescission would mean that the original 2012 policy would be in place. But that's not exactly what happened. The Trump administration took several weeks to make any kind of announcement or change. And eventually they did come out with a little bit more guidance. And what they did is that they chipped away at the policy once again. They did not go back to the 2012 policy. They said, we're going to allow only current applicants to continue to apply. So no new applicants. A lot of new applicants or eligible DACA recipients were waiting on the ruling because they thought that this would allow them to apply, right, and take advantage of some of the protections. But the Trump administration essentially said that is not going to be the case. Not only that, but we're going to reduce the protection period from 2 years to 1 year. And so now recipients are having to apply every couple of months, right? And not only that, you cannot apply, but you must apply within 100 to 180 days before it expires, which of course raises the question of, does the USCIS agency have enough capability and capacity to process so many applications, right? In other words, will the recipients get their protections in time to not lose the protections and potentially be out of a job or out of an opportunity to remain in higher education? And then they also said no advance parole, so you cannot travel abroad unless it's an extreme circumstance, and that's sort of subject to interpretation. And so practically speaking, the changes by the Trump administration have implications for students on the ground who may not have the resources to pay for processing fees every couple of months, right, to renew. It only shortens their time when they can have that quote unquote peace of mind, right? And through my work, recipients have often referred to the protections as allowing them to live and plan their life in 2-year increments. And so now what we're going to see is that they're going to have to plan their lives in 1-year increments, right? So the change in federal policy highlights the need for states and institutions to provide the resources for sure that would help the students. So just to conclude here, with the Biden administration, they have been pretty clear that they're in support of reinstating the policy again, the 2012 policy. And so what can we expect if they do restore the policy? Well, we would have the 2-year protections, the advanced parole, and would probably allow new applicants to enjoy the benefits as well. And we always hear, right, elections matter, and they matter for many different reasons, but for DACA recipients and those who qualify but are unable to apply today, this election is an opportunity to receive those protections and have some security in their lives. And finally, I just want to emphasize that executive action, as powerful as it is in the area of immigration, it has some big limits as well, right? Specifically for DACA recipients, they deserve some permanence, and permanence that can only be achieved through congressional legislative action through immigration reform. So thank you so much. I know that I was out of time, so I didn't mention the COVID piece, but the COVID really has exacerbated the concerns for this DACA recipients, right? Like now they might be displaced from having a home on campus. like what do they do now that they're not necessarily operating under similar constraints? So we're out of time. I'll turn it over to Tessa. Thank you.
Thanks, Raquel. That was really interesting. I didn't understand the pockets of inclusion exclusion or the complete banning of undocumented students that was happening in some states. It reminds me a bit of the idea of the conditions of statelessness that happens for some refugees, where the lack of documentation results in the lack of rights and then a lack of access. So it really underscores that value of DACA as a means for access. That was fascinating. So we'll go ahead and get started with our Q&A. We already have a couple of questions from our audience. Our first question is from Mike Halba, who asks, related to programs in place for Hakan, programs in place that might be specifically targeting the challenges that you mentioned and how well they're working. So have you seen any examples since the start of COVID-19 of Turkish higher education institutions implementing or expanding support programs for Syrian refugee students?
Well, yes. Thank you, Mike. It is a very nice question. Actually, I just think of some practices for Syrian refugees during the pandemic times. Actually, a couple of examples, maybe some of the universities paid the internet cost of refugee students. A typical internet fee per month is $10 actually, and some universities pay this cost so that the university expects them to connect the online courses easily. And also almost all the universities used to offer some Turkish language classes for Syrian refugee students because their mother tongue is Arabic. And when they are accepted to university, if they don't speak Turkish, first of all, they are provided with 1 year compulsory Turkish language classes. And if they pass the proficiency test in Turkish, and then they can start their undergrad or master's education. So the universities in Turkey continue providing these Turkish language courses in online platforms during the pandemic. And a couple of universities actually offer some psychological support services online. But as I said before, of course, it is not that possible to get some nationwide statistics right now. But as I check from a couple of gatekeepers from the universities, I see that even though the universities offer some online support services, most refugee students cannot access them as they did before the pandemic. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you, Hakan. We have a question from Irina Degitarova, who asks all the panelists what the role of student community itself, so student self-government or student organizations, may be in adaptation of refugees and internally displaced persons in receiving access to higher education. And Irina and her colleagues studied this issue in the Ukraine, where Russian military aggression caused displacement of thousands of students. So would anyone like to take that? Lisa?
I can jump in maybe just to start us off. Irina, I would be fascinated to hear more about the work that you did. And I should have said, I'll put my email in the chat. I'd love to follow up with anyone who's interested in talking more about this. So my sense of this is that it really varies dramatically, not only across national contexts and state or provincial contexts, but also institutional contexts. There are certainly some examples that I'm familiar with of student groups and student organizing having created a number of programs that can be seen as both participatory and supportive in higher education settings at different levels. So for example, Pima Community College in Arizona is a standout in this regard. There are a number of Canadian student organizations that are associated with WUSC, which essentially is a program by which students have elected to tax themselves in order to raise money to bring students of refugee background into Canada to study at universities and then receive permanent residency when they finish. And there's a program at the University of Hamburg, which has been, well, money has been given by the central authority of the University of Hamburg. And essentially they have said, we want to support a participatory refugee community that's focused on women. And we'd like this to be open both to enrolled students and prospective students, and those students should determine what programs will be offered, with the idea that engagement with the university is facilitated. So I'll stop there.
Would anyone else like to take a stab? Raquel, Hakan.
Raquel, would you like to go first or can I?
Sure, you can go ahead.
Okay. Actually, there is a little bit, you know, some maybe negative perception towards refugee students, especially in the host societies where entrance to university is quite competitive, like Turkey or some other developing countries. Every year, for example, in Turkey, 3 million local students take the university entrance test, and just maybe 1 in every 5 can get into university. This, of course, creates a tension in the society. So in a study I conducted a couple of years ago, I explored that if local students meet refugee students on the campus in some student communities activities, in some orientation programs, actually, they get to know each other. And actually, they respect their refugee classmates' access to higher education. So when they get to know each other, actually, they accept them at the university more easily. That is why actually the role of student communities and other orientation programs, which include these student clubs, is really important.
Yeah, I agree with everything that my colleagues here have shared. The only thing that I would add is that to draw on the work that I was just speaking about, for DACA recipients in higher education, these group organizations are really critical in creating like peer networks and helping them commiserate, right, about the experiences that they do have on campus, and to build their cultural capital, right, to learn to navigate the higher education system. So they play a really critical role in higher education.
We'll do one more question to Raquel. Is there any possibility in sight for the DACA protections to become long-term or permanent, such that it would not slide back with another administration? This is from IEW.
Yeah, this is such a fascinating question, actually. I think it is, if you would have asked me this a couple of maybe months ago, it would have been less clear. Because in part, the ability for this to become a permanent solution lies with who holds the Congress and the House and the Senate. Right now, we know that the House is taking the majority there, but the Senate actually is still up in play. So we've got 2 more seats that are going to be very decisive in terms of who's going to control the Senate, and they're going to be down in Georgia. And so depending on that, it would be more manageable and likely that there could be a permanent solution. So the reason why Obama chose to do this through executive action was because he didn't have the majority, right, in the Congress. And so he knew that the Republicans were not going to support the kind of legislation that he wanted to propose. So if Congress, House of Reps, Senate aligns with the Democratic Party, and we have Biden in office, it is likely that there would be some legislation that passes. Otherwise, I see it highly, highly unlikely. This has been sort of an issue for debate ever since the early 2000s. And people often describe it as playing political football with the lives of people, right? And so we'll see, depending on how Georgia goes.
Thanks, everyone. I think it's about time to close up. So if you have more questions, Lisa's put her email address in the Zoom chat. Excellent way to round up this webinar. Thanks to all our panelists, to Hakan, Lisa, and Raquel for sharing your research and insights and helping us think through policy and practice of social justice for marginalized and displaced people in this year of global crises. Just before we close, since I assume our audience shares our love for international higher education and refugee studies, we do have a few events coming up that might be of interest. Tomorrow, in fact, Lisa, Anangst, Hansuit, and others are panelists for an event drawing from the recent publication, Refugees in Higher Education, Transnational Perspectives on Access, Equity, and Internationalization. You can register for this event here. I've put the link in the chat. International Education Week is also ongoing for the rest of November with a slew of events that may be of interest, continuing on the same theme of embracing social justice in the wake of a crisis. The events for that are listed here. And also the Center for International Higher Education has a number of really top-notch events scheduled for the November and December. Our very next event is with Kara Godwin and Huayan Ye on the topic of institutionalizing liberal arts education through innovation. So please do take a look and register for that if you like. That's available here. Also, if you'd like to stay connected with the Center for International Higher Education, you can follow us on Twitter at BC_CIAG, but also please do subscribe to our open access quarterly journal, International Higher Education, and the link for that is here. And once again, thank you to our panelists, and thanks to all of you for joining with us and engaging in discussion today. And we look forward to seeing you at a future event soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.